Hi, everyone. Just one moment. Hi. Good evening. My name is Maggie, and on behalf of Book Soup, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us for a virtual event this evening with Grady Hendrix discussing the final Girls Support Group. We're so excited and grateful that our bookstore can continue to bring authors and their works to our community during this time. We'll be hosting more virtual events in the near future, and you can learn more about them on our website, booksoup.com, as well as our social media at BookSoup. Our next event is Monday, July 19th with Scott Shepard in conversation with Julie Clark discussing The Last Commandment. Just so you know, Grady will not be answering questions tonight, but you can order a signed copy on the link by clicking the link on the side chat. Grady will personalize the book too. Just indicate to whom you would like the book signed in the comments field in your order. Support our local bookstore and our authors and purchase a copy of tonight's featured book. Just click on the green purchase button that reads the Final Girls Support Group directly below the viewer screen. The link will redirect you to our website where you can continue your checkout process. We're also selling digital audiobooks and ebooks through Libro.fm and Kobo for those who are interested. A little more about Grady. He is an award-winning novelist and screenwriter living in New York City. He's the author of Horror Store, My Best Friend's Exorcism, which is being adapted into a feature film by Amazon Studios. We Sold Our Souls, and the New York Times bestseller, The Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires, which is being adapted into a TV series. He's also authored the Bram Stoker Award-winning nonfiction book, Paperbacks from Hell, a history of horror paperback boom of the 1970s and 80s. And without further ado, I'm going to turn the camera over to Grady. Enjoy the presentation. Thank you. Okay, and...
Hi, like you just heard, my name's Grady. I'm the author of the Final Girl Support Group. I'm going to be talking to you for about an hour and 5 minutes. I can be very precise about this. This may run a little long, it may run a little short, but I think about an hour or 5 is what we're going to be in for tonight. We're going to have some laughs, some cries, learn a little, love a little, and we're going to select 3 of you randomly to win sets of Final Girl Support Group trading cards that come foil wrapped. We'll be emailing you afterwards if you've been randomly selected. And I say randomly, but really, if you win, that's because you're one of the 3 best people on this Zoom. I don't know you. I don't know how tall you are. I don't know what you drink first thing in the morning. I don't know what inspirational quote you have tattooed on your wrist. But I know one thing about you. Old or young, American or Canadian, Black, white, Asian, Latinx, or prefer not to answer, you don't want to get murdered. Ever since the invention of the printing press, we've been writing and selling books, and a disproportionate number of them are about murder. Ever since the motion picture camera was invented, we've been making movies, and a lot of them are about murder. You would think this means we love murder, that we enroll our kids in after-school murder programs, go on vacation to murder parks, and spend our Friday nights trying to get a reservation at that hot new murder restaurant. Believe it or not, it's the opposite. Human beings spend a surprisingly large amount of time trying not to get murdered. And you're saying to yourself, but Grady, you're right. I don't want to get murdered. But how? Ever since I got on Facebook, I've been worried about pretty much everything in the world murdering me. I'm here to help. Ever since I was a small ginger child, I've been watching movies and reading books in which large numbers of people get murdered. So I'm here tonight to give you some tips on how you cannot get murdered. First, simple ground rule, don't make friends. Friends get you to do things like sneak into a mall after hours where you'll be murdered by security robots, or sneak into a carnival after hours where you'll be murdered by the owners to form Monster Sun, or go camping where you'll be murdered by pretty much everything that lives in the woods. Friends will invite you for trips on their yacht, or to share a timeshare on the ski slopes, or to a costume party, and sounds like fun, you'll die. Friends like to play pranks on each other, which inevitably go wrong. Maybe they put a corpse in your bed and trick you into making out with it. Or maybe they mischievously push you out a second-story window to your death. Or they lure you into a bathroom for sex, then give you a lace joint, douse you with acid, and leave you disfigured. It's all a good laugh. But now you're going to have to hunt them down one by one years later and murder every single one of them. Where friends are concerned, you're better off getting a cat. Or not. Next, step 2 in not getting murdered, drop out of school. By sixth grade, you can read and write, do long division, and play the recorder. What else do you need? If you're smart, that's where you drop out. Because if you want to do trig, go to American AP's history, or learn about the symbolism in The Great Gatsby, you will wind up dead. Whether it's a straightforward public school like Central High or Crawford Academy, Montreal's elite academic institution, if you go to high school, you will die. Boarding school is not a loophole. If you manage to survive high school and go to college, I hate to say it, you deserve what you get. You've been warned. But parents who are out there tonight on this call, on this Zoom, if you have a child who insists on going to a school, get a pen. I'm going to give you a quick list of colleges and universities to avoid. Lanier College, Pritchard College, Wendell College. It had to be university, DeWitt University, St. Trinian's College, Windsor College. I've heard some students who survived Pendleton University thought it was a good idea to transfer to Alpine University. No. And if you think this doesn't apply to you because, oh, I'll be participating in Greek life that offers a support network and safety in numbers, well, I laugh at your naivete. And don't even get me started on medical school. Now, step 3 in the whole plan of how not to get murdered. And this is important, okay? Don't go anywhere. In fact, and by the way, don't go to your class reunion. In fact, don't do anything. Don't do anything. Don't go anywhere, okay? Don't go on vacation. If you go on vacation, don't go to Texas. Don't go to the supermarket. Don't go to the hospital. Don't park your car. Don't babysit. Don't play sports. Don't go to the gym. Don't support sports. Don't go to the gym. Don't play paintball. It's a sport. Don't go to prom. Don't go to camp. Just stay home or not. A biggie, and I try to impress this on people because this is a lot. I'm throwing a lot of stuff at you, a lot of big ideas, and you're thinking, whoa, I'm getting overwhelmed. So let's start with something very basic, okay? This is something you can do tonight. Very simple. Don't answer the phone. Phones are very, very bad. Sometimes you answer the phone and it's someone telling you that car insurance for a car you don't even own is about to expire. Sometimes you answer the phone and it's someone telling you they're going to kill you. Sometimes you answer the phone and it's your mom wanting to tell you about an article she read on Facebook. Sometimes you answer the phone and it's a high-pitched digital noise that melts your brain. If you're a chandelier salesman named Chad who recently shaved your beard, when you answer the phone, more often than not, it's going to be a serial killer. Chad lives in Houston. And he's constructed a successful career selling what the author of Night Calls describes as things that could be constructed around one or more light bulbs. Human beings, we simply call these lights. One night, he receives a phone call on a device that is constructed around the receiving or making of one or more phone calls. And the phone call's from a serial killer who's torturing a woman to death. And he makes Chad listen. This is so upsetting to Chad that when he calls the police and they send over Detective Sharon Reason, he immediately begins flirting with her because nothing gets you in the mood to seduce one woman than listening to another woman get tortured for hours before being shotgunned in the face. Night after night, the night caller becomes more and more annoying and more deadly, not unlike a telemarketer. Finally, Chad lets the calls go to the answering machine. This turns out to be a terrible idea. Once the killer realizes he's gone to the machine, he shotgun murders 5 people to reinforce to Chad the notion that he should never do call screening when the serial killer calls. But it turns out the killer isn't actually murdering people. He is actually murdering people, but when the police psychiatrist shows up, he helpfully explains that the killer's shotgun is actually a penis. And when he pulls the trigger, he's actually ejaculating. And when people's brains splatter all over their wallpaper, he's actually impregnating them. But also the police psychiatrist goes out to a bar with Chad and Detective Reason, then leaves them alone so they can enhance their personal relationship. Hopefully not with a shotgun. Actually, although you could see how in a dark room you might get that mixed up with your penis. And actually, as the psychiatrist points out, there's no such thing as a dark room. There are only wombs. The police set clever traps to catch the killer, like putting deep discounts on some swanky chandeliers in the hopes that the killer will be drawn to these irresistible bargains. Chad, on the other hand, decides to use the radical strategy of actually listening to what the serial killer has to say, which, as any woman who's ever gone out on a date with a man will know, is a rare quality. Chad listens so hard that he uncovers the killer's primal hamster trauma that turned him into a serial killer. When the killer shows up at his latest victim's stylish condo, Chad gets there moments later because he's tracked him down by tracking down the traumatic hamsters. The police surround the condo with their guns drawn, trying to lure Chad into luring the killer outside so their sniper can lure the bullet through his brain with his penis. Or is that impregnating his brain with a shotgun? I get them mixed up. Chad is shocked and affronted by all this violence and instead uses his unnatural listening abilities to talk the killer into surrendering, promising him that he'll never be alone again and he'll get him all the help he needs to learn how to tell a penis from a shotgun again. And the killer listens, and Chad listens, and it's all very healthy and sane. And the book ends with the situation de-escalating in a totally non-macho way as the killer bursts into tears and Chad's hold him while he cries, I'm scared. You don't need to be scared, Chad says. I'm here now. Then he opens the door and begs the police not to frighten his new friend who recently murdered 11 people. So, in closing, the next time you want to answer the phone, send a letter or not. Primal hamster trauma, or as we like to call it in the business, PHT, is only one reason people grow up to be serial killers. Sometimes they become serial killers because the little girl they liked in first grade crumpled up the Valentine card they gave them and threw it on the floor. Sometimes they become serial killers because they saw their mothers murder their fathers. Sometimes they become serial killers because their mother yelled at them for doing a jigsaw puzzle. Sometimes they got lost in the woods after their mother died and turned into homicidal cavemen. But they all have one thing in common. Every single one of them becomes a serial killer because of something that happened to them when they were a child or something a child did to them in their childhood. Because children are horrible in slasher movies. They taunt orphans, they crumple up Valentines, they set cabins with sandy men at camps on fire so they get disfigured and have to come back 10 years later and murder everyone. So you get that why in a lot of serial killer books and movies, murdering children is very, very popular. Welcome to Goldsmith, Alabama. Maris McCready, seen here on this beautiful Lisa Falkenstern cover, is not just a serial killer pedophile. He also pretends to be handicapped so he can get a special handicap discount taxi service and get 10% off at the Shoney's Breakfast Bar. As Dr. Loomis in Halloween would say, look into the eyes of pure evil. Dressing as a nurse in an outfit he inherited from his sister because he wants to become his sister, Maris prowls the Alabama woods, spying on little girls, asking to examine their swollen glands, and then killing them. He calls himself the Blue Fur Lady, but he also calls himself Sister, and later he'll call himself the Beautiful Phantom, and everyone's like, make up your mind! And then for a while he calls himself Tootsie after his favorite movie. Now, it's PTA night, and Maris, or Sister, or Tootsie, or the Blue Fur Lady knows that 15-year-old Todd will be babysitting his little sister while their parents are at the meeting. And Todd's idea of babysitting is to put Jessica before the television set and tell her to stay there while he retreated to his room and blasted his psyche with Bruce Springsteen music. After murdering Jessica in front of the television, Maris retreats to his lair full of Garfield memorabilia and reads his precious comic book collection because rock music plus comic books equals dead children. Who will stop this crazy, my psychotic, trans comic book reader? Prince Gannon, of course, a third grader with a rare blood condition that means all he gets for an after-school snack is one raw carrot. Prince's daddy is secretly dying of cancer, which we know because he recites the poetry of John Donne at the dinner table and says things like, well, son, I believe in the magic of the human spirit. And as we all know, the only people who say things like that in books and movies are people who will be dead soon. Prince has a magic girlfriend in the woods named Nandina, who has a hunchback, a withered arm, and wears a burlap dress. She lives with her Aunt Evie and is worried that something bad is coming that she can feel in the atmosphere, and she is also a ghost and can do magic. Meanwhile, Clay Lawrence, a tough cop from Atlanta, Georgia, and why a tough cop from Atlanta, Georgia has been sent to Alabama to solve a crime, I don't know. Ask Stephen Gresham. He's been sent here to solve the crime before the killer strikes again, and now the killer is suddenly on a lunar cycle, which he hasn't been yet in the book. Why is he on a lunar cycle? Probably because the author read that in Red Dragon, the 1981 award-winning serial killer book from Thomas Harris, in which the killer is on a lunar cycle. Now, why am I just making this leap in logic that Stephen Gresham read Red Dragon? Well, because he reproduces entire scenes from Red Dragon, only the stupid versions. Clay Lawrence spends most of the book worried about what will happen to his comic book collection if he gets murdered by the Blue Fur Lady. So now we all know what's going through Jodie Foster's mind when she's in that killer's basement at the end of Silence of the Lambs, her comic books. Clay's manner of investigation is a little unorthodox. He wanders around aimlessly until he arrests Alberto D'Angelo, a pedophile of the non-murdery variety, who's been living inside the ducts of the First Methodist Church. And you know what? It's a false arrest, but I'm okay with that. The fewer pedophiles we have living inside the air conditioning and heating systems of our Methodist churches, the better. And if that makes me a bigot, so be it. However, besides making sure that churches belonging to Protestant denominations that follow the teachings of John Wesley have pedo-free HVAC systems, what does Clay Lawrence do to stop the Bloofer lady? Not much. Nandina, on the other hand, says, I'm telling you, boy, I'm more than a little scared of this here killer. So Prince demands that she teaches him shadow magic, which is too stupid for me to describe here, but basically she teaches him to shrink down into a sparkling ball of shadows, and he flies around town. Things come to a climax at the birthday party for Prince's other one-armed girlfriend. Yes, he has two. And I want to point out that this birthday party for this third grader with one arm is advertised on the local radio station, which seems a little unwise with a serial killer killing pedophile on the loose in this town, unless maybe you hate your children and want to offer them up on a plate with a sign next to it that says free samples. I don't know. But Bloofer, Maris, Tootsie, sister, tries to abduct the little one-armed birthday girl, but Prince uses his shadow magic to make the Bloofer lady run away. However, he can't identify the killer because he can't remember what the killer looked like. I mean, he saw them, but he just, if only there was some detail he could tell the police. And then 2 weeks later, he remembers the killer was dressed as Garfield, the cat. Knowing they're on the lookout for someone with a larger than average collection of Garfield memorabilia, Nandina and Prince track down Bloofer, who is stuck into an elementary school classroom using his Star Wars lightsaber flashlight, written "Nobody gets out of here alive" on the chalkboard, urinated all over the classroom rules, stolen a scarf, tied it on his head, then ripped it off and left it on the teacher's desk with a note that reads, "Dear Madam Bitch, I'm planning to strangle you with this scarf. Yours truly, the monster." Then he rubs a Raggedy Ann doll all over his stomach until he realizes that a child beat him up because he's trying to become a woman, and he needs to break the chains of gender altogether and become the beautiful phantom, who is neither male nor female, a sexless beautiful phantom. Nandina and Prince at this point use their shadow powers to track down Maris, and Nandina hypnotizes him with her spooky ghost lights while Prince smacks him on both cheeks with hands dipped in hawk's blood. I don't know where he got hawk's blood from. It just happens. Then he tells Clay the cop to come to the lair, and Clay finds the Bloofer in his room, helpfully covered with photos of the dead children with X's drawn over their faces. And whether he's Bloofer Lady the monster, Maris' sister Tootsie, his own sister, or the beautiful phantom, one thing all of Maris' multiple personalities have in common is a serious bullet allergy. But Cop Clay is haunted by killing another human being. And so he gives Prince his comic book collection, which I think is a suicide metaphor, and leaves town. Prince cures his daddy's cancer with his shadow magic, but ironically, the strain accelerates his own blood disease beyond the point where eating raw carrots can treat it. And since that seems to be the only medical treatment available in Alabama, Prince dies. Like you, this book left me with a lot of questions. And the biggest one I have is, why do murder books hate trans people? Sometimes a book changes everything. The Exorcist started a whole wave of horror fiction in the 70s, Jaws that kicked off the killer animal craze. And in 1988, Silence of the Lambs was that book. And its game changer status got solidified a few years later when Jonathan Demme's 1991 movie swept the Oscar awards, taking home Best Picture, Best Director, Best Actress, Best Actor, Best Screenplay, and making Anthony Hopkins' Hannibal Lecter a joke on The Simpsons, and also launching a whole wave of serial killer books and movies. The movie's very familiar, so we don't need to recap it. But if any newborn infants are on this Zoom, I'm just going to give them a quick summary. Silence of the Lambs is about an FBI agent hunting a serial killer with the assistance of another serial killer. The helpful serial killer is played by Anthony Hopkins. The bad serial killer is played by Ted Levine. The helpful serial killer eats his victims and murders numerous police officers over the course of the movie. The bad serial killer skins his victims and doesn't murder anyone during the movie. However, we know he's bad because he puts on makeup, tucks his penis between his legs, and wants to be a woman. During its initial release, the filmmakers waved away any criticisms from LGBT groups by saying that the bad serial killer wasn't gay and he wasn't trans, he was just confused. And we all bought it because probably we'd been conditioned by decades of serial killer books and movies that claimed the easiest way to spot the killer was by looking for the guy in the dress. In 3 on a Meat Hook in 72, the killer cross-dresses, just like Leatherface at one point in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Cross-dressing and trans killers appear in Deranged, Relentless 3, Fatal Games, Dressed to Kill. The entire climax of Sleepaway Camp consists of the revelation that the killer is trans, a moment that was so shocking in 1983 for its Crying Game-style revelation that it blew the minds of teenage boys everywhere. And it's not just murder books. Murder movies. Murder books are almost as bad. In Richard LaPlante's Steroid Blues, we meet Jack Dunn, a bodybuilder who lives in a depressing house in Philly where he takes a ton of steroids, prays a lot, gobbles Valium, but also meth, so it's confusing. Then he pumps iron until his muscles hurt and screams, help me, into a tape recorder in an increasingly high-pitched voice. He also has a beard, lots of body hair from all the steroids he's shooting, and a wiener that's constantly flopping out his little bodybuilding trunks like a, quote, brown, oversized earthworm. It actually hangs halfway down to his knee. Ladies, I guarantee the next time you're on a date and you want to bring it to a quick end, just ask to see their brown, oversized earthworm, and I think it'll be all over. Jack Dunn likes to dress up as his dead sister, Jacqueline Dunn. Uh-oh, yeah, trans, gonna be a killer, so he's no surprise. Jack's other hobby, punching people to death. It turns out that his sister, Jacqueline Dunn, was a bodybuilder who used to go to Animals, a gym run by Horst Nichols, a neo-Nazi powerlifting steroid dealer, whom we first meet cracking open frozen monkey skulls on the corner of his desk and sucking out the raw glandular fluid. Horst wears a black and red silicone spandex unitard and an enormous pair of prosthetic silicone testicles built into the crotch, and he's German, so he says things like, "What's happening?" and "Get out of the fucking way." He seems to have also sex murdered Jacqueline. But then it turns out that Jack Dunn isn't Jacqueline Dunn's brother. And it turns out that Jacqueline Dunn wasn't a steroid-addicted gym bunny sex murdered by Horst Nichols. It turns out that Jacqueline Dunn was a cop sent undercover to bust Horst Nichols' steroid ring, but he got all up in her head and turned her into a bodybuilding, steroid-shooting gym bunny and killed her brother, Jack Dunn, to threaten her into throwing the case. Jack Dunn is actually Jacqueline Dunn, who is so hooked on steroids that she's grown enormous muscles, a thick mat of body hair, a full beard, and that brown oversized earthworm that hangs down halfway to her knee is her clitoris. Because you know what happens if you go to the gym too much? You turn into a man. The anti-trans trope is way too pervasive to spring out of nowhere. But where? Neither transsexuals nor transvestites make the FBI's profile of serial killers, so it doesn't reflect reality. If you follow this toxic trail back far enough, you feel like you've arrived at Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho in 1960, the zeitgeist-changing hit about Norman Bates, a serial killer who dresses as his mother. But behind Hitchcock's movie is Robert Bloch's book, Psycho. And the book and the movie are very similar. They parallel each other pretty identically, with the major difference being that in the book, Norman Bates is an obese middle-aged man who's obsessed with his mother, and in the movie, he's young, handsome Anthony Perkins who's obsessed with his mom. Bloch got the idea for Psycho when he was 41 years old, with no money, no prospects, and a stalled writing career, trapped in a tiny Wisconsin town. Then, Ed Gein happened. A local Wisconsin boy, Guy was arrested nearby for murder in 1957, and when police searched his house, they discovered it was stuffed with trophies and accessories made from the skin and bones of his victims and multiple bodies he'd exhumed from local cemeteries. Guy went down in history as a necrophiliac transvestite who wore women's skin and kept his mother's corpse in the basement. The problem was, Guy wasn't a necrophile, nor was he a transvestite, and he never exhumed his mother's body. He did wear women's skin, however. These ideas seem to have all sprung from an 8-page Life magazine pictorial that threw in the line, it's called House of Horrors Stuns the Nation, and it threw in the line that Guy wished he were a woman. The only catch? A psychiatrist hadn't even examined Guy when this article was written. As the local crime lab director said about this article, it's news to me. Life got the idea about Guine's wishing he was a woman from the Milwaukee Journal, which wrote about Guine's unnatural attachment to his mother, quoting an unidentified investigator. That unidentified investigator was never identified because they probably didn't exist. They also got an armchair psychiatrist from Chicago who'd never met Guine to claim that Guine wished he had become a woman instead of a man and shows signs of acute transvestitism. The actual psychiatric profile of Guine, the one that was written by actual psychiatrists who actually examined Guine and wasn't just written to sell papers, said nothing about transvestitism or cross-dressing, or his mother's corpse for that matter. All this cross-dressing talk seems to have derived from a single polygraph transcript in which the operator, Joe Wilimowski, suggested to Guine several times that he enjoyed wearing women's clothing and body parts. Maybe so, that could be, Guine cheerfully admitted, and suddenly he was a transvestite who wanted to be a woman for the rest of eternity. This is a good place to note that Guine was also noted as being highly suggestible and had trouble telling the difference between things that had actually happened to him and things he imagined had happened to him and things that people told him had happened to him. So why did Wilimowski insert cross-dressing into Guine's story? Was he drunk? Did he hate trans people? Well, the late 1950s saw America growing increasingly hysterical over crime. The juvenile delinquent was the most terrifying figure in pop culture, and the United States Senate had just held hearings about how comic books turned good boys bad. Within months of Guy's arrest, Charles Starkweather went on a shooting spree in the Midwest for reasons no one could understand, followed by the apparently motiveless clutter killings that turned into the in cold blood murders. Then came the 1960 arrest of Melvin Rees, another serial killer. Why were white men suddenly killing everyone for no good reason? Well, there was an obvious answer. Their mothers. A psychiatric theory making the rounds in the 40s and 50s claimed that mothers who showed too much affection for their sons turned them into criminals and sexual deviants. If your mom was close to you, there was a good chance you'd wind up a sissy. Philip Wiley's bestseller, Generation of Vipers, in 1942, laid everything at Mom's feet. Mom's first gracious presence at the ballot box was roughly concomitant with the start towards a new all-time low in political scurviness, hoodlumism, gangsterism, labor strife, monopolistic thuggery, moral degeneration, civic corruption, smuggling, bribery, theft, murder, homosexuality, drunkenness, financial depression, chaos, and war. Jesus Christ, Mom, cut it out. Robert Moskin wrote in 1958 an article in Look called The American Male, Why Do Women Dominate Him? Richard Green published a study called The Sissy Boy Syndrome in 1987, based on research he'd started back in 1953, trying to identify why some boys grew up to be gay and trans, and he laid it all at the feet of their mothers. Unlike father, a mother's involvement and investment with sons must be only temperate. It must be finely tuned to provide the son with security and emotional warmth. There must be just enough mother to round off the hard edges carved by father. She must not smother, stifle, or feminize. The psychological profile of the Boston Strangler, incidentally, developed by the police around this same time to help catch him, cast him as a probable homosexual, and his mother was a punitive and overwhelming woman. As late as 1980, the DSM claimed transsexualism seems to always develop in the context of a disturbed parent-child relationship. Extreme, excessive, and prolonged physical and emotional closeness between the infant and its mother, and a relatively absence of the father during the earliest years will contribute to the development of this disorder in the male. And there you have it. A busted psychiatric theory about how mothers made their sons gay and trans got shoehorned into the case against Ed Gein by eager psychiatrists, and they made it into Robert Bloch's novel based on Gein case, which wound up in Alfred Hitchcock's hit movie based on Bloch's book, which flowed out like a poisonous river, leaving its rancid traces on dozens, if not hundreds, of serial killer books and slasher movies. It's an idea that persists today, even among people who should know better, like these kids wearing Mama's Boy Ed Gein t-shirts. When you Google Ed Gein, most current articles describe him as a mama's boy who is ruined by his domineering mother, a narrative that totally leaves out the fact that, according to Gein himself, his father was an alcoholic nightmare who physically abused Gein and his brother for years. Fun fact, the Boston Strangler also had an alcoholic, abusive father. But why pay attention to that? After all, we all know that everything is always mom's fault. So, children and mothers, both to be completely avoided if you do not want to get murdered or become a murderer. If you have a mother or a child in your house, I suggest after this Zoom, you kill them instantly. So who else becomes a killer besides mothers and children? Well, mutant cannibal redneck families, avoid those. Escapees from mental hospitals, avoid those also. Overly competitive people, this one doesn't get as much attention as it should, but whether you're an actor who really wants a role, or a mascot who wishes she was a cheerleader, or an Olympic athlete who's taken steroids and transitioned to male to female so you can compete in women's events and you're killing everyone who knows your secret, competitive people are terrible. But some people kill because they blame other people for their problems, and it's hard to wrap your heads around this, so just hear me out. Pamela Voorhees murders all those campers at Camp Crystal Lake because she blames them, totally irrationally, for the drowning death of her son. Then her son grows up to murder campers and counselors for killing his mom in the previous movie, and I get it. He loved his mom. He's upset she got decapitated. Although you think that by the time you get to Friday the 13th, Part 8, Jason Takes Manhattan, he's lost his way a little here, you know? But I get it. It's easy to blame other people for your problems. But I want to take a minute to talk to you guys and just say, if you are rescuing someone who got injured while skiing and broke your leg in the process, thereby ending your Olympic dreams, it doesn't make any sense to wait until years later to invite all that guy's friends to a timeshare on the ski slopes and murder them one by one with icicles. If your family died in a fire where it was started by an insane cult leader who locked the doors of the movie theater while showing his short film and burned everyone to death and burned you beyond recognition, it is not okay to track down his daughter years later and murder everyone who's attending her all-night horror movie marathon. People, no, stay focused, accept responsibility. Some things are our own faults, okay? Don't blame other people. That is a hard path. But there are some killers that it's not their fault. They're not too competitive. They're not blaming other people for their problems. There's one type of killer who is totally blameless in all of this. One killer who kills because he doesn't know any better. He kills because teenagers broke into his home. He kills because it's all he knows. You know I'm talking about deformed monster sons. It's now time to kill a teen. They broke in on a dare. You're deformed. That's not your fault. We are mutant inbred scum. Abduct a girl. Howl a little. If you want, you two can marry. Obey me. I am old, but I'm your daddy. You scream and carry on. And I know that it's not easy to be calm when you found teenagers in your safe space. Take your time and kill them slow. Maybe gnaw their flesh a little, for you will still be here tomorrow, but these teens will not. How can I try to unexplain? When I do, they run away again. It's always been the same story. Since I was born, I can't talk, kept chained up in the basement. I don't want to kill anyone, but I don't know my own strength. Daddy keeps you on a chain because look, you're killing teens again. You've got the mind of a child in the body of a man. You're too strong, that's not your fault. And your skull, it's just misshapen. Just settle down in your straw and stop making all that noise. All the times that I've cried, keeping all the things I feel inside. Don't they know I'm more scared of them than they're scared of me? I have broken my own chains and packed my stuffed animals. I'd rather be in something PG like the Goonies. And I know I have to go away. And I know I have to go. Normal or deformed, blaming other people for their problems, or just overly competitive. People have been killing people for thousands of years. But tonight, I want to just shift gears away from deformed monster sons and all these other killers, because we're not talking about your average everyday murder slobs here. We're talking about celebrity serial killers. So let's hop in the Wayback Machine and talk about murder's first big name brand, Jack the Ripper. The Ripper killed 5 people between August and November 1888. Overachiever. But he wasn't England's first serial killer. That was Mary Ann Cotton. He wasn't even the first Victorian serial killer to target prostitutes. That's Dr. Cream. He wasn't even the first 19th century murders to become famous. That would be the Ratcliffe Highway murders, all the way back in 1811, which was an unsolved home invasion in which 7 people were killed, and hordes of tourists came to the house for months afterwards to look at the brain bits splattered on the ceiling. But Jack the Ripper set our modern day slasher template. Newspapers paid advertisers for premium placement to ensure they were on the same page as illustrations of the Ripper's victims, who were depicted nude, dead, and with unrealistically perky full breasts on full display for the journalistic integrity. Jack the Ripper had a great name because he named himself in a letter to the police. And even better, no one knew who he was. Newspapers claimed he was a Russian anarchist, a policeman, a Native American, a sailor, and a cowboy, which basically meant he was the 19th century village people. There were theories that he was a mad doctor, a religious fanatic, an upper middle class erotic maniac, a sociologist seeming to wake London up to the plight of its poor by killing them, a woman, a corrupt cop, and Jews. All Jews, in fact. Every single Jew was suspected of being Jack the Ripper. Even Queen Victoria wrote Scotland Yard her own private psychological profile of the Ripper, telling them that he was probably a sailor. The first modern day murder book appeared in October 1888 between Ripper Murders 4 and 5, when John Francis Brewer wrote the very first Ripper fan fiction, The Curse upon Mitre Square. in which he claimed that Jack the Ripper was the ghost of a 16th century monk who killed his sister and haunted Whitechapel to this day as the incarnation of pure evil. Reviewers called the book thrilling and condensed as a meat lozenge. In 1889, a man known only as Rhodesi wrote Lord Jacqueline Berkeley, The Whitechapel Terror, about a man named, not surprisingly, Lord Jacqueline Berkeley, who was the Whitechapel Terror. There was the Whitechapel Murders, or an American detective in London, in which a Pinkerton detective goes to London to solve the Ripper killings. Then Jack the Ripper in New York, in which the Ripper goes to New York to commit more murders. There were fictional first-person Jack the Ripper diaries published in Scandinavia. There was Flemish Jack the Ripper plays, even Wie Jack der Aufschütze Gerstad wird, a German novel in which Sherlock Holmes captures the Ripper. In 1911, Ripper fan fiction went respectable with Marie Belloc Lowndes' short Ripper novel, The Lodger, published in McClure's magazine. Gertrude Stein and Ernest Hemingway were big fans, and Alfred Hitchcock turned it into a silent movie that became a blockbuster in 1926. Hitchcock adapted it as a radio play in 1940, and for years he wanted to do a color version of it, but he couldn't get it together. Ultimately, the rights had some complications, so he had to settle for making movies about men murdering women who were not Jack the Ripper. How did we get from Jack the Ripper to now? How did we get from this to this? It all comes down to a very simple number, Z500-599. So, did you guys hear the story about the babysitter? So, my sister's best friend was babysitting these kids on Halloween, and a guy escaped from a mental hospital and put on a mask and killed a bunch of people with a butcher's knife. And then the babysitter killed him, but they couldn't find his body, so he's probably still out there. Yeah. But actually, before that, my brother's girlfriend had a cousin who was in a sorority at college in Canada where they call it university. And one Christmas, everyone had to go home, but some of the girls hadn't left yet. And they started getting these weird phone calls from a really crazy guy who killed a bunch of them. And the police traced the call, and the last girl left. And they were like, "Get out of the house. The calls are coming from inside the house." And she ran away. Yeah, okay. But actually, before that, this woman I work with, her mom's best friend's daughter's guidance counselor's sister's niece was babysitting in California, and she started getting these phone calls from a crazy guy, and the cops traced it and told her to get out of the house because the calls were coming from inside the house. And she ran to get the kids, and the killer came after her with a knife, and she brained him with the freezer door, and then ran outside where the cops were just showing up, and they shot him to death. That last one is Foster's Release, a 14-minute student film made in 1971 at USC Film School by Terrence Winkless, a man who was most famous for playing Bingo the Gorilla on the Banana Splits Adventure Hour. Foster's Release played at a USC Film Festival where it was definitely watched by Winkless's classmate, John Carpenter, who went on to make Halloween in 1978. It also played around at the Edinburgh Film Festival, and then it got distributed all across America as a short film shown in high school home economics classes to, quote, initiate a discussion of babysitting responsibilities and crisis response. As the film's booking material claimed, beyond the chilling entertainment value of the film, the girl's handling of the situation exemplifies decisive action in threatening situations. Foster's Release may be ground zero in the modern day slasher film, but it's not. The slasher actually goes back further to a specific urban legend floating around since the 60s, known as The Babysitter and the Man Upstairs, in which the babysitter gets the threatening phone calls and the police trace them and they're coming from inside the house. Slasher movies draw on urban legends to create their faceless killers, tapping into our collective unconscious, and The Babysitter and the Man Upstairs is one of 3 urban legends that shape the genre. In Ernest Bauman's landmark Type and Motif Index of the Folktales of England and North America, these urban legends are classified under serial numbers Z500 to Z599, covering horror stories, quote, which are not ghost or witch stories, but which are told because of the effect of the horror they produce in the listener. Usually the emphasis is on the grisly strange rather than the supernatural. So even earlier than The Babysitter and the Man Upstairs, there's a story about 2 roommates at college after everyone left for the holidays. One went out and the other stayed home, but woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of gurgling and scratching in the hall. She locks the door, scary stuff, and when she went out in the morning, she found her roommate's dead body in the hall with her throat slit by an escapee from a mental asylum. There's another version where the roommate comes back late from being out at a bar, and there's a note on the door that says, don't turn on the light, and she goes in and it's dark, and she gets in bed and goes to sleep. When she wakes up in the morning, she sees her roommate dead in bed, and in her roommate's blood on the wall is written, aren't you glad you didn't turn on the light? There's actually 31 variations of that specific folktale collected since 1961. But there's one even earlier and even more essential to slashers than that one, and it has to do with Dear Abby. On Tuesday, November 8th, 1960, a letter appeared in the syndicated device column Dear Abby. Dear Abby, if you are interested in teenagers, you will print this story. I don't know whether it's true or not, but it doesn't matter because it served its purpose for me. A fellow and his date pulled into their favorite lover's lane to listen to the radio and do a little necking. The music was interrupted by an announcer who said there was an escaped convict in the area who had served time for rape and robbery, and he was described as having a hook for a hand. The couple became frightened and they drove away. When the boy took the girl home, he went around to open the car door for her and he saw a hook on the door handle. It had been ripped off the killer's arm. I don't think I will ever park or make out as long as I live. I hope the same goes for the other kids. Signed, Jeanette. This is the story of the hook, which has been recorded by folklorists as early as 1951. The folklore archives at the University of California, Berkeley hold 70 different variations. And the hook has it all, just like a slasher movie. Teenagers in the woods, some desolate location, trying to have sex, getting attacked by an unseen, unnamed killer with an unusual weapon, a hook, and from that, drawing the conclusion they should never have sex again. Researchers in the 50s and 60s found versions of the hook in Maryland, Wisconsin, Indiana, Illinois, Kansas, Arkansas, Texas, Oregon, Canada, Utah, New Mexico, but it's not that simple. The earliest outbreak of hook stories sprang up in Los Angeles around Mulholland Canyon in 1947 and 48 during a citywide panic over the red light bandit. An unidentified man terrorized Los Angeles with a series of robberies and sexual assaults on young couples parked in Lover's Lane, using a red spotlight mounted on his car to make them think he was a cop. The police eventually arrested Carol Chessman, and he was sentenced to death, even though he hadn't killed anyone, thanks to the creative application of an anti-kidnapping law that was applied to him because he dragged one of his victims 22 feet from her cars. Chessman was a publicity hound who maintained his innocence right up until the end, so maybe the real killer was still out there. And he wrote and published 4 books while in prison, one of which got made into a movie in 1955. Sociologists point to a huge surge in hook stories in 1960, the same year as that letter to Dear Abby, and the same year that Chessman was very publicly and very controversially put to death. These urban legends became Foster's Release, which became Black Christmas, which became Halloween in 1978, which opened the floodgates for the golden age of the slasher. From 78 to 84, there were 150 slashers hitting the screen in a 6-year period, starting with Halloween, Friday the 13th, Nail Gun Massacre, Microwave Massacre, Toolbox Murders, Icebox Murders. As the golden age ended, slashers just kept coming, but they began to embrace the fact that their main characters were teenagers, which appealed to progressively younger audiences until we finally arrived here. Slasher YA and middle grade books starring Jason and Michael murdering 11 and 12-year-old kids and marketed to young readers. Then, after slashers became for kids, there came the next step in the evolution of celebrity serial killers when they became superheroes. Gifted with powers that put them beyond the range of normal slobs like you or me. Thomas Harris's Silence of the Lambs gave us Hannibal Lecter in 88, a smarty pants doctor with maroon eyes and one too many fingers on his hand who essentially has ESP. He fit right in with Freddy Krueger, the superpowered Scarface dead pedophile who killed people in their dreams at the height of the slasher boom, and they would inspire killers like Temple Galt in Patricia Cornwell's best-selling book series, a gay super hacker karate expert serial killer, or Rex Miller's Chain Gang Bunkowski in his book series that started with Slob, a 400-pound super serial killer who can turn invisible by regulating his respiration and heartbeat, has a genius-level IQ, understands fluid mechanics, and is immune to poison ivy. With all these superhuman ninja serial killers running around, we needed superheroes to catch them, and Thomas Harris invented them too. In his 1981 Red Dragon, he introduced us to FBI profiler Will Graham, a dude so dedicated to catching serial killers that he gets all up inside their heads until he thinks like they do. Graham kicked off a whole slew of mind hunters, and they're real, man. The FBI's behavioral science unit, established in 1971, was so good at mind hunting that their profiling resulted in 5 arrests out of 184 cases. That's a 2.7% success rate. Another major study showed that profilers were only marginally better than people recruited off the street at predicting offenders' cognitive profiles, physical attributes, offense behaviors, or social habits. But that didn't stop writers because they needed Batman super profilers to fight their Joker super serial killers. Fictional profilers in these books are dedicated men with strong convictions, men who come to small towns where evil has been done, men who examine the evidence at the scene of the crime, using their years of training to identify the guilty, hoping to stop these godless monsters before they strike again. You know who else did this exact same thing? Witch hunters like Matthew Hopkins and Nicholas Remy, men of faith who went to small towns armed only with their extensive religious training. And as agents of the law, they went to the scenes and used clues to reconstruct the identity of witches before they could kill someone else for the glory of Satan. So these profilers don't come any more dedicated than Dr. Dean Grant, star of Dead Man's Float. Medical examiner for the city of Chicago, Dean Grant is a tall man with a reddish mustache and light in his blue-gray eyes. Ooh, tell me more. His experience with human frailties, human viciousness had jaded him into an outwardly casual cynicism that was, in truth, deep-seated, running amok at times, to the point where he had few friends. Sounds haunted. In his professional life, he displayed calm, controlled, and yet passionate concern for the job at hand, often spilling over to a madman's deliberate obsession. Sounds passionate. When the local cops tell him that the body of 12-year-old Laura Baines, found floating in an Indiana lake, is there because Laura, like most seventh graders, has drowned herself in despair in the middle of winter, which actually seems on brand for Indiana, Dr. Dean Grant proves to the police that no 12-year-old would do this because they wouldn't fold their clothes and leave them piled neatly on the shore like little Laura. Someone else was here. Minds blown! The cops back off, leaving Dr. Dean Grant to crouch over their pile of Laura's neatly folded clothes, murmuring, "Laura, little girl, you're my priority number one. Priority number one." Driven, obsessed, dedicated, Dr. Grant even cancels his anniversary plans with his wife, Jackie, who cries, "Jesus Christ, Dean, so what? Another floater. There's always another floater, and always has been, always will be," which seems a bit harsh because it is a 12-year-old child who's been murdered, but whatever. That doesn't bother Dean Grant, who will solve this floater crime with science. But how? There aren't any clues. Aha! As he says, anything's possible in forensic medicine. And it is, because author Robert Walker just makes it all up. First, Dr. Dean Grant sprays the dirt around the clothes with Seconal. Most of us think of Seconal as a powerful sedative, but are we doctors? No. Dr. Dean Grant knows that Seconal will glow in the dark whenever it touches moisture. Later, he'll use infrared photography to detect footsteps in a water puddle. Then he'll employ a small nuclear reactor he keeps in his lab to create the killer's hair chart from a clipping of a single hair, and apparently the hair chart is unique as fingerprints. Dr. Dean Grant can scrape condensed human breath off plastic bags. He can take a human being and have them breathe on a microscope slide, put that slide in the tracer, which uses laser beams to turn it back into a liquid. I don't know, is that how breathing works? And then he knows what's in it. How does this, it's science, folks. The same science that describes bourbon as a chemical and napalm as a poisonous gas. But Dr. Dean Grant doesn't just rely on science. He also has his own instincts, which include a superhuman ability to detect when people are lying, although his detector wasn't any more reliable and even less admissible evidence than a polygraph, but it was faster and surer. So it's not reliable, it's not admissible as evidence, but it's fast and sure. Get those wishes to the stake, stat. It turns out that little Laura is the victim of a conspiracy by a girl who's possessed by her failed Catholic priest dead brother. These sinister supernatural siblings are drowning people across America to send them to God, and they've been doing it for years. And dumb local police departments without access to a man of science like Dr. Dean Grant, who whispers to neatly folded clothes, have just been labeling them all as accidents. In later adventures, Dr. Dean Grant encounters an obese deli butcher who faints at the sight of blood and communes with the astral spirit of King Solomon when he gets high by huffing the breath of his victims as he traps them inside plastic bags and asphyxiates them over the course of several hours. He also battles a maniac armed with a laser blowtorch trying to kill the disembodied soul of his mother that flits from woman to woman. But no enemy tests him as deeply as the one he encounters in Razor's Edge when he goes to Orlando, Florida, and falls in love There's a serial killer at work in Orlando who's scalping his victims alive, and Dr. Dean Grant is invited to assist. There he meets Dr. Ben Hamill, police psychiatrist. When Dr. Grant meets him, the two men shake each other's hands, firmly get caught in each other's gaze. And then Dr. Grant keeps thinking about how handsome Dr. Hamill is, remarking repeatedly that he looks just like Henry Fonda in My Darling Clementine. Uh-oh. Dr. Hamill looks so much like Henry Fonda that Dr. Dean Grant cannot say no when he invites him to dinner. There, Dr. Hamill says, "Do you mind if I call you Dean?" And Dr. Grant blushes and stammers, "No." Then Dr. Hamill insists he call him Ben, and after telling Dean that he knows the scalpings are the work of two serial killers working as his team, because if you look over serial killing, the worst ones tend to involve two people or more, which is not true at all. Then they have a final parting manly handshake like doctors should, and Ben holds on for a long time and gently caresses Dr. Dean Grant's hand. Cursed with the gay boner, Dr. Grant receives a lucky break when Carson, a tough lady cop, is attacked by the scalper. But she escapes. She confirms not just that it's two men working together, but one of them is a midget. That should narrow down the suspects because, as Dr. Dean Grant notes, it simply was not likely that two separate man and dwarf murder teams could be at work in Orlando at the same time. Using irresponsible leaps in logic and totally fabricated forensic nonsense, Dr. Dean Grant learns that this man and dwarf murder team are Van, a lizard-eating dwarf who's very hairy and who was kept chained in his basement by his parents as a child where rats nibbled off one of his ears. He has a double row of teeth like a shark and dresses like a Dickensian street urchin. His entire body is covered in hair, more hair than most men grow in a lifetime, we're told. His ears grow hair, his forehead grows hair, his back and shoulders grow hair, his buttocks grow hair. Ironically, the only place that doesn't grow hair is his head. But in order to please Satan, who loves hair and has promised to make him a dark wizard when he's entirely covered in hair, Van and his partner are looking for a scalp that he can turn into a toupee that will fool the Prince of Darkness. Who's the partner? Dr. Ben Hamill. Van is his brother, and Ben worships Van because of his all-powerful hair, because Dr. Hamill has no body hair, and so he eats big bowls of hair stew and rubs gels made from the fat of his victims all over his body so he'll absorb its powerful DNA and grow hair just like his brother. But when his brother starts going on about wanting to scalp babies, Dr. Hamill is like, "I don't think that's a good idea." And Van's like, "You don't do the thinking around here, cue ball." And then he beats Dr. Hamill senseless with a bullwhip made of braided woven human hair. Also, the two brothers, no lie, they are absolutely nuts for the musical genius of Bob Seger. It all ends in brother-on-brother scalping and Dean versus Dwarf wrestling matches, climaxing when the brothers are eaten by an alligator, which one of the Orlando PD calls a fitting Florida end to that little man. And as we bring our time together tonight to a fitting Florida end, we've gone from Jack the Ripper through Ripper fan fiction, through urban legends, through Ed Gein, through Robert Bloch, through Alfred Hitchcock, through the babysitter murder movies, to Halloween, to the slashers of the 80s, to the slashers getting more juvenile, to serial killers becoming superpowered, and now we're here. And now I'm going to talk to you about the end result of all that decades of evolution, the Final Girl Support Group. Because it took me a very, very long time to write this book, almost as long as this show. I checked the first file I actually had on this book. It usually takes me about a year to write a book. And the first file is dated January 9th, 2014. But in reality, I started working on this book 40 years ago in 1981. As a kid, I was not allowed to watch R-rated movies. I read the Marvel comic book adaptations of them, like the Alien comic, and I pretend to have seen it. Sometimes I get to read the Mad Magazine parody of a movie and pretend I'd seen it, which was a little tricky because they lied in those parodies. But I wanted people in carpool to think I saw R-rated movies. So I came up with this great solution. So after Cub Scout meetings, we'd go across the street to the Oasis gas station and buy snacks. And I managed to convince my Scoutmaster that I was allowed to buy magazines with my snack money because, reading. So my first magazine I picked up was Fangoria number 12, April 1981. And I read their feature seen here on the cover of the opening scene of Friday the 13th Part 2. And I read it again, and I read it again. And if you don't remember the movie, Alice Hardy, played by Adrienne King, is the final girl from the original Friday. And now it's the beginning of Part 2, and she's chilling in her weird plaid overalls in a crummy apartment on a rainy night, having nightmares, jumping at loud noises, arguing with her mom on the phone, when out of nowhere Jason appears and ice picks her in the head. My mind was blown. She went through all that savagery and bloodshed in part one, lost all her friends, decapitated Miss Voorhees, is trying to put her life back together in this crummy apartment, and they just knock her off. The casual cruelty of that hit me hard. You think it's just another Wednesday night in Albany, but really, you're in the sequel. There is no escape. There is no mercy. You're not a person, you're a body count. And ever since then, I always wanted to rewrite that moment to give her a happier ending. So 40 years later, I've written the Final Girl support group, and I get Adrienne King's, the actress's, email from my friend Ted, and I get in touch and I send her a copy of the book. And she loves it. And she calls me up and we get to talking. I tell her about this issue of Fangoria and how much that the beginning of that movie really stuck with me. And Adrienne tells me a story. When Adrienne first made Friday the 13th Part 2, she was 21 years old. She'd had fun making the first Friday movie and wanted to do the second, but she told the producers she was having some personal issues they might have to work around, but no big deal. So she doesn't hear from them for a little while, and eventually she gets a call, and she shows up on set, assuming she's the star of the movie on the first day of shooting. In reality, it's the last day of production. They didn't give her a script, they didn't give her any sides, but it doesn't bother her too much. She did a Friday movie, a lot of it's improvising. So they asked her to improvise this phone call with her mom, react to a noise outside, walk around her apartment, and she doesn't actually know what's going to happen until the stuntman playing Jason appears and stabs her in the side of the head with an ice pick. You see it in the movie if you watch it. Friday the 13th movies are not shy about their kills, but there's only one single shot of Adrienne getting an ice pick in the head. No elaborate gore effect, no shot of her dead body, one and done. Because when they did that, they tipped their hands and she knew what was going on. The personal issues that Adrienne was having at the time was that she had a stalker. This guy was nameless, he was faceless, and he followed her and took pictures of her everywhere, in public bathrooms, having coffee with her friends, and he'd leave them on her front door of her apartment. He was everywhere. He was nowhere. He told her that no one would ever believe her if she reported him. It got so bad that she had to put a lock on the inside of her bathroom door to feel safe enough to take a shower. When the nameless, faceless stuntman playing Jason sunk that fake ice pick into the side of her head, Adrienne didn't know what was happening. She was the star of the movie. But suddenly it was over. They wrapped it. They put her in the car, drove her back to the motel where she was staying, dropped her off, and left her there, totally isolated, cut off, completely alone. I wrote the Final Girl support group partly because I wanted to write a happier ending for a final girl I'd seen in a magazine 40 years ago. But I also wrote it because I was starting to worry about what was wrong with me. I love horror movies, and I've been watching them most of my life, and that means I've spent 40 years watching people get murdered for fun. And I don't want to get murdered. It's not like I'm taking notes here. So what the hell was going on? People think of slasher movies as sort of these camp artifacts from the 80s, little nostalgic nuggets, but they are real life, modern day, all American horror stories, the one we live every day, the one where a heavily armed man walks through a supposedly safe space, a school, a college, a spa, our apartment buildings, and methodically murders everyone he can find. Get a little more existential about that, right? Pull out a little, and maybe you're some guy who read about a horror movie in a magazine 40 years ago, and now you're writing the end of that book in August 2020 during the second wave of the pandemic, huddled behind locked doors, all your windows and doors closed and locked, suspicious that any stranger you meet might wind up making you dead, where a trip outside requires intense planning, where you're isolated, cut off, and all alone. And outside, there's a faceless killer stalking all the places we used to go. Summer camps, gyms, supermarkets, everything we did for fun, prom, sports, vacations, they're all gone. Hospitals aren't places of safety. They're the last place you want to wind up because you will die. College dorms lie empty. The only thing beyond our locked doors is something that wants us dead. And I realized as I wrote the end of Final Girl Support Group that I love a nihilistic ending as much as the next maladjusted weirdo. But the horror movies I love, the ones I come back to over and over again, were the ones with the final girl in them. The ones where these women appeared and they come in with their big sister energy and grab our hands and they say, run. And so we run. We run through the dark woods, all of us, filling up the space between the trees, running at full speed, tripping, falling down, getting up over and over again. And we can't stop and we can't turn around because the killer is right behind us and he's gaining with his machete or a butcher's knife or a chainsaw or a pizza cutter or a sharpened camera tripod or an icicle or a coronavirus. And the woods are full of us and we are all running. And imagine this is a shot in a movie, okay? And if we just pull back and get a wider angle, we see our killers right behind us. Jasons and Freddys and Michaels and Normans and Ted Bundys and Ed Geins and that guy from the bar who won't take no for an answer and that stalker and that drunk driver and that building inspector. And we pull back further and we see that behind them are their monsters chasing them, their abusive fathers, their schoolyard bullies, their poverty, their dead too soon parents, their closed skull injuries, their alcoholic grandparents. And back further, we see the monsters right on their heels. And there's monsters, back and back and back all the way until we see the one monster coming for us all in his hooded robe carrying a great big scythe. And up ahead of us, we look and the trees are thinning and we're coming to the edge of the woods and we can see the sky and it's getting lighter and we realize we've made it. We are going to survive, and behind us are the ones we left behind, the ones who didn't make it, the ones we lost, our grandparents, that girl from work you talked to a few times, our great aunts, all those hundreds and thousands of people that died in nursing homes, who died in ICUs, who died alone. But we survived. At any second, the credits are going to roll and we made it. We made it one more day and we didn't have to be strong. We didn't have to be smart. We didn't have to have a master plan or an escape route or a handgun with good stopping power or a sense of danger. All we had to do was just not stop. That's how you don't get murdered. Because every day is a horror movie and the next day is always waiting for us because there's always a sequel. And all we have to do is keep running. All we have to do is get up when we fall down. All we have to do is just not quit, and we survive. The original and the sequel and the threequel and the spin-offs and My Dumb Fucking Life part 14,603, the final chapter part 2. Adrian didn't die in that motel room where they dropped her off after she got ice picked with that prop in the Friday the 13th part 2. Her stalker didn't get her. She kept going. She left New York, she headed out west, she did stunts in Ghostbusters, she started a career doing dialogue looping and voiceover recording. If you've ever seen Titanic or Jerry Maguire or Philadelphia or Mouse Hunt, you've heard Adrian. It's Final Girl, hidden down in the soundtrack. She runs a winery now. And 40 years after, a kid in a Cub Scout uniform stood in an Oasis gas station wishing he could write a different ending for this 21-year-old woman he'd never met. We met. And Adrian wound up narrating the Final Girl Support Group audiobook, and she crushes it. We don't watch horror movies to see people die. We watch them to see people survive. Let's roll the closing credits. It's time to say goodbye. And please remember, we are all going to die and die and die and die and die and die and die. Every single one of us will die and die and die. It's the thing we have in common, the thing we can't outrun. Dying in a car wreck or getting too much sun. Use sunscreen hacked up by machetes, attacked by wolverines. Maybe it's a power drill or COVID-19. Every college dorm is bloody. Every summer camp is cursed. Every frat house is a slave ground and sororities are worse. Maybe it's a heart attack or maybe by harpoon. But death is out there waiting for everybody on this Zoom. We're all going to die and die and die and die and die and die and die. Every single one of us will die and die and die. So let's roll down all our windows. Let's turn off all our alarms. Let's drive into the countryside and enter haunted barns. Let's investigate strange noises like a bunch of stupid jerks. Let's plan a long camping trip where our phones don't work. Let's pull pranks on younger children and creepy janitors. Let's dance around this cursed mound and let's not lock our door. And die and die and die and die and die and die and die. Every single one of us will die and die and die. There are many different ways to die, some better and some worse. But every sentient being will die across the universe. Suns will die and stars will die, babies, puppies too. Whales and snails in great big pails of interstellar goo. Dummies, mummies, fluffy bunnies, those with high IQs. Pretty ponies, guys named Tony, girls named Celia's too. Kings and queens and in-betweens, and so one day will you. You'll die and die and die and die and die and die and die. Every single one of you will die and die and die. Thanks for coming out to see me, but it's time to say farewell. We may never meet again. So I'll see you down in hell, because we'll die and die and die and die and die and die and die. Every person on this Zoom will die and die and die. Thank you for coming out, everyone. Have a good night. Don't die yet.
Thank you. And that's a wrap on our presentation. Thank you again to Grady and to all of you who tuned in this evening. We greatly appreciate everyone's time and your support of independent bookstores. Please support our bookstore and our authors and purchase a copy of tonight's featured book. Just click on the green purchase button that reads the Final Girl Support Group directly below the viewer screen. If you'd like regular updates on our upcoming events, make sure to follow us on Crowdcast and subscribe to our newsletter. Have a great evening and stay safe, everyone. Stay safe.